Everyone in Red Mesa called the Rowe Ranch dead. They said the land had been dry for years, the well had gone blind, and even rattlesnakes crossed the fence line without stopping. The house leaned toward the east like it was tired of standing. The stable roof sagged. The windmill had only 2 blades left, and both of them screamed when the wind turned mean. So when Maggie Rowe's in-laws left her there with 1 carpetbag, a swollen belly, and no horse to ride back to town, people shook their heads and said she would last 1 night, maybe 2, if pride kept her standing. Maggie did not come to the ranch looking for hope. She came because the wagon that brought her there did not wait. She came because a widow with no money and a child on the way had fewer choices than a stray dog. But on the first morning, she found hoofprints circling a dry trough. Fresh ones. Small ones. Then she saw the foal. It should have been dead. There was no hay, no mare, no open water anywhere on that cursed land. And yet its muzzle was wet. That was the first sign that somebody had lied about the ranch. It would not be the last. The wagon wheels did not sound like departure at first. They sounded like a mistake. Maggie stood beside the leaning gate, with one hand under her belly, and watched the red dust rise behind Caleb Rowe's team. Her husband's older brother kept his eyes on the road, not on her. Beside him, his wife sat stiff-backed beneath a black bonnet, her mouth pressed flat, as if pity itself might cost money. "Caleb," Maggie called. The wagon slowed, but it did not stop. He turned only halfway. In the low sun, his face looked carved out of worry and shame. "The key's on the nail inside the kitchen," he said. "There's a blanket in the back room if rats haven't taken it." "That's all?" His wife touched his sleeve. Caleb swallowed. "You heard, Ma. This is Rowe property. What's left of it?" Maggie looked past him at the house with its empty doorway and windows filmed with dust. "I heard her call it a mercy." He flinched. For 3 days after Daniel's burial, Maggie had listened to his mother speak as though grief were an expense that needed cutting. There was no room in the family house. No money for a doctor. No sense in feeding a woman who could not work the fields. The baby, still turning inside her, had been discussed like weather damage. Caleb had said little then. He said little now. "If anyone comes asking about buying," he muttered, "you ought to hear him out." Him? Any man with cash. His gaze flicked once toward the stable, quick and nervous. "And don't go tearing through old boxes or papers. Nothing out here can help you." That was the first thing he said that did not sound like cruelty. It sounded like fear. Before Maggie could answer, he snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, carrying away the last familiar voices she had in the world. She waited until the dust swallowed them. Only then did she let her knees bend. The baby shifted hard, a slow roll beneath her ribs. Maggie breathed through it the way her father had taught her to breathe through a frightened horse. Steady hands, soft voice, no sudden panic. Her father had never owned much. A narrow barn, 3 patient mares, a box of tools wrapped in oiled cloth. But he had taught Maggie to look before she believed. A dry trough did not always mean no water. A limping animal did not always mean a broken leg. A man talking kindly did not always mean kindness. She opened her carpetbag and took out the hoof knife. Its wooden handle was worn smooth from her father's palm, before it became worn smooth from hers. After marrying Daniel, she had kept it hidden because his mother said barn tools made a woman look common. Now, with no one left to impress, Maggie slipped it into her apron pocket. The kitchen smelled of mice, dust, and old smoke. The key Caleb promised hung on a nail, though there was no door worth locking. A table lay on its side. A blue cup sat cracked in the corner. In the back room, she found the blanket, stiff with dirt, but whole enough to fold beneath her. She should have searched for food first. She should have walked the road before dark and begged shelter from someone with a roof that still remembered rain. Then the sound came from the stable. Not loud, not human. A thin scrape, followed by a breathy, broken nicker. Maggie froze. The stable leaned worse than the house. Its roof had caved in along one side, letting late sunlight fall through in dirty bars. She stood at the entrance and waited until her eyes adjusted. Something moved near the far stall. The foal was the color of dust after rain, though Maggie could not imagine rain touching this place. Its legs trembled under it. Its ribs showed in narrow shadows. Dried burrs clung to its mane. When it tried to step away, its front hoof dragged against a rope twisted around a broken rail. "Oh, little one," Maggie whispered. The foal threw its head up, wild-eyed. Maggie stopped moving. She lowered her gaze, turned her shoulders slightly, and let silence do what force could not. Her father's voice came back to her. "Don't chase fear. Give it room to choose you." After a long minute, the foal stopped shaking enough to breathe. Maggie took one step, then another. Outside, a boot struck loose gravel. The foal jerked so hard the rail creaked. Maggie spun toward the stable door, but the yard was empty. Beyond the fence, high on the ridge, a dark figure stood between two clumps of mesquite. Too far to name, close enough to know she had been seen. "Who's there?" Maggie called. The figure did not answer. A gust crossed the yard. Dust blurred the ridge. When it cleared, the figure was gone. Maggie's hand went to the hoof knife. The foal made the broken sound again, and that pulled her back faster than fear. She knelt beside the rail, sawed carefully at the rope, and felt how raw the hair beneath it had become. This animal had not merely been left, it had been held. When the rope fell away, the foal did not run. It stood trembling, then lowered its head toward Maggie's sleeve. She touched its muzzle with her handkerchief. The cloth came away damp. Maggie stared at the dark spots spreading through the cotton. The well behind the house was empty. The trough was dust. There was no bucket, no barrel, no stream bed within sight. Yet this starving little creature had found water somewhere. Maggie looked toward the back of the stable, where the dirt lay darker beneath a scatter of stones. For the first time since the wagon left, her fear changed shape. It did not leave her. It became a question. By morning, the ranch had stopped looking empty. It looked watched. Maggie woke on the kitchen floor, with the dirty blanket under one hip and the hoof knife tucked beneath her hand. Dust moved through the broken window, like the house was still breathing, slow and sick. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the baby pressed against her ribs, the windmill screamed outside, and memory returned with the taste of old smoke in her mouth. She sat up too quickly and gripped the overturned table until her head steadied. The 2 biscuits in her carpetbag were hard as fired clay. She ate half of one anyway. Her small canteen held less than a cup. The foal needed it more. That should have frightened her. Instead, it gave her something to do. She crossed the yard after sunrise, keeping to the thin shade of the house. The main well sat behind the kitchen, circled by cracked stones. Its rope was gone. Its crank was rusted still. She dropped a pebble and waited. No splash came back, only a dry tick far below. "Blind well," she whispered. Her father had used that phrase for wells that looked honest from above and lied underneath. Sometimes they were truly dead. Sometimes the water had moved sideways. Sometimes somebody had made sure no bucket could reach what remained. She did not follow that thought too far. In the stable, the foal stood where she had left it, head low, one ear turned toward the door. Maggie poured a finger of water into her palm. The animal sniffed, drank, and bumped weakly against her wrist for more. "I know," she said. "I know." She checked the raw place where the rope had burned its leg. There was swelling, but no break. The rope itself lay where she had cut it, stiff with dirt and old sweat. Maggie picked it up and frowned. It was not rotten like the rest of the stable. Someone had tied that animal recently. A wagon creaked beyond the fence. The foal jerked back so hard its hoof struck the stall wall. Maggie slipped the hoof knife into her pocket and stepped outside. A man in a cream-colored coat sat in a polished black buggy by the front gate. 2 matched bay horses stood harnessed before it, sleek enough to look insulting against the dead yard. The man removed his hat when he saw her, slow and courteous. "Mrs. Rowe," he called. "Silas Vane. I own the spread north of here." Maggie said nothing. He smiled anyway. "I heard Daniel's people brought you out. I thought you might need water." Beside him sat 2 covered jugs. Maggie's throat tightened before pride could stop it. She crossed halfway to the gate, then stopped. "That is kind. It is practical." His eyes moved over the house, the broken windmill, the stable roof. "No woman in your condition should be left in a place like this. In my condition, most folks seem comfortable leaving me where they please." A flicker crossed his face. "I knew your husband," Silas said. That made her look at him fully. "Not well," he added. "Daniel came by my place twice last month. Worried about this property. Worried about what would happen after." Maggie kept her hand on the gatepost. Daniel had not told her that. Silas leaned back, voice softening. "I can help you avoid a hard road. I will buy the ranch. Cash. Enough for a room in town, a doctor, and food until the child comes." The offer came too cleanly. Too soon. Daniel had been in the ground 4 days. "You came all this way to buy a dead ranch." "I came to spare a widow from learning how dead it is." Behind Maggie, the foal gave a thin, frightened sound. Silas's gaze shifted at once to the stable. Not to Maggie's face. Not to her belly. To the stable. "You have been in there?" he asked. The question was gentle, but something beneath it was not. "I heard an animal." His fingers tightened around the brim of his hat. "Strays wander in. They do not last. This one has." For the first time, his smile failed. He stepped down from the buggy and lifted one jug. "Take the water. No charge for decency." Maggie wanted to snatch it. Her tongue felt thick. The baby turned as if nudging her toward sense. But Caleb's warning rose with the dust. "If anyone comes asking about buying, you ought to hear him out. And don't go tearing through old boxes or papers." "What would I have to sign?" she asked. Silas paused. "Nothing today. That means something tomorrow." Now he laughed, light and brief. Daniel chose a sharp woman. He chose a living one. Silas looked toward the stable again. "Living things suffer longer out here." The words settled between them like a threat dressed as mercy. Maggie opened the gate only wide enough for the jug. When he handed it over, his eyes slipped past her shoulder, measuring the stable door, the back wall, the ground beyond it. He was not looking at ruins. He was looking for something. Silas climbed back into the buggy. "I will return with papers. Read them if you like. But do not mistake stubbornness for strength, Mrs. Rowe. This land has broken better families than yours." The buggy rolled away, raising a clean ribbon of dust. Maggie waited until he disappeared. Then she carried the water to the stable instead of the kitchen. The foal smelled it and stepped toward her, still trembling. As Maggie poured a little into the cracked trough, she glanced at the darker patch of earth behind the stall. Silas had looked there too, and that meant someone was afraid of what she might find. The first job was not water. It was making one corner of the ranch safe enough to survive another night. Maggie dragged the fallen table from the kitchen wall and used broken chair legs to brace a loose board over the window. The sun had climbed high, turning the room bright and cruel. Every movement made the child inside her press lower, as if the baby understood that shelter mattered before pride. She found a rusted pan, a cracked lantern with no oil, and a tin of salt gone hard from age. In a cupboard, behind mouse droppings, there was half a sack of cornmeal so old it smelled like dust. She sifted it with her fingers, kept what was clean, and told herself it was breakfast if a person was desperate enough. She was desperate enough. Outside, the foal called once, thin and uncertain. Maggie carried the water jug to the stable and poured only a little into the trough. The animal drank too fast. She pulled the jug back before it could founder on what its body had forgotten how to hold. "Slow," she whispered. "You and me both." The foal's ears flicked toward her voice. Maggie cleaned the rope burn with water she could not afford to waste. Under the dirt and swelling, the leg was better than she feared. The hoof, though, was chipped along one side. She took out her father's hoof knife and worked carefully, shaving away the cracked edge while the foal trembled. Her hands remembered before the rest of her did. For a few minutes, she was not a widow left on dead land. She was a girl in her father's barn, bent over a patient mare, learning that an animal gave trust 1 inch at a time. Her father had always said the hoof told the story the mouth could not. This hoof told one too. The foal had not wandered freely. Its small prints were crowded near the stall, then dragged toward the dry trough, then circled back as if it had tried the same path over and over. But one set was different. Near the rear of the stable, where fallen boards cast long shadows, the tracks went straight toward a scatter of pale stones and disappeared. Maggie crouched, one hand braced against the stall post. The stones lay behind the last stall, under a strip of wall where the roof still held. Nothing grew there except a gray clump of cactus and a few brittle weeds. The ground around the stones was darker than the rest of the yard, but not soft. It had been packed hard, as if pressed down by boots, not weather. Hands. The thought made her look toward the ridge. It was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched remained. By afternoon, the heat made the stable boards pop. Maggie forced herself back to the house, mixed cornmeal with a spoonful of water, and cooked it over a small fire made from broken chair rungs. It tasted of smoke and iron, but it sat in her stomach, and that was mercy. Then she walked the road. Or tried to. The front track curved past the dead windmill and through a gap in the fence toward town. She had seen it clearly when Caleb brought her in. Now, less than a day later, 3 fresh cedar posts stood across the gap, strung with new wire. Maggie stopped so suddenly the baby kicked. The wire was bright. The knots were tight. Whoever had put it there had worked in the dark and known exactly where to block her. She touched one post. Sap still bled from the cut. Behind her, near the stable, the foal screamed. Maggie ran as well as she could, one hand holding her belly, the other gripping the hoof knife through her apron. She reached the doorway breathless. No man stood there. No buggy, no horse, no Silas Vane. But the foal was backed into the corner, eyes white, nostrils wide. A boot print marked the dust just inside the door, large, fresh, pointed toward the rear stall, not toward the animal. Toward the stones. Maggie listened. The ranch answered with wind. She searched the stable slowly, checking behind loose boards, under the old saddle rack, around the collapsed feed bin. Nothing moved, but the rope she had cut lay kicked aside, and one pale stone behind the stall had shifted half an inch from its place. Someone had come close enough to touch what she had been studying. That meant she had not imagined its importance. As the sun dropped, Maggie did not light a lantern. She sat in the kitchen dark with the water jug between her knees and waited for the ranch to settle. When the wind died, she heard sounds she had missed before. Cooling boards, dry grass scraping the wall, the foal shifting in the stable. Then, after midnight, another sound came. A soft step outside the fence. Maggie did not move. A second step followed, then a pause. Whoever stood out there knew better than to walk openly. The foal made no sound this time. That scared Maggie more than a scream. She rose, took the hoof knife, and crossed the yard barefoot, keeping to the shadow of the house. The moon was thin, but enough light lay across the ground for her to see the new fence wire gleam. Beyond it, someone breathed. "Caleb?" she whispered. No answer. The breathing stopped. Then came the careful crunch of retreating boots. Maggie waited until the silence stretched. Only then did she return to the stable and kneel by the stones. The foal stepped out from the stall and lowered its head, not to the trough, but toward the rear wall. Maggie moved the shifted stone. Beneath it, the earth was cool, not damp on the surface, cool underneath, where the desert should have held the day's heat like a stove. She pushed aside another stone, then a third. They had not fallen there. They had been laid flat, tight, deliberate, like a lid. Maggie pressed her palm to the exposed dirt. This time, when she lifted her hand, the dust clung dark to her skin. The land was not empty beneath that wall. It was hiding something. Maggie began before sunrise because the desert had not yet learned how cruel it wanted to be. She carried Silas Vane's jug to the stable, set it where the foal could smell it, and poured only enough into the trough to keep the animal from crying. Then she knelt behind the rear stall with her father's hoof knife and started working at the stones. They came up harder than they should have. Some were wedged flat under packed dirt. Others had cactus roots woven over them like stitches. Maggie cut the roots, lifted each stone, and laid it aside in the order she found it. If someone had made a lid, she wanted to know how it had been built. By the 6th stone, the ground changed. Not soft, not open, cool. She scraped away another layer of dust. The dirt beneath was dark enough to stain her fingertips. When she pressed her palm down, a thin shine gathered between 2 grains of sand and vanished, before she could be sure she had seen it. The foal nickered behind her. "I saw it too," Maggie whispered. She dug with the knife until the blade struck something that was not rock. A strip of old canvas, buried and stiff. Beneath it lay smaller stones, packed in a narrow line, too neat for accident. She pulled the canvas free. A smell rose from the ground. Not rot, not oil, not the dead mineral smell of an empty well. Wet clay. Maggie closed her eyes. For one dangerous second, hope moved through her so sharply that it hurt worse than fear. She worked faster. That was her mistake. A pain tightened low across her belly, sudden and hard. Maggie dropped the knife and braced both hands against the dirt. The foal startled. The stable tilted in her vision. She made herself breathe, slow and even, the way she had breathed the night Daniel did not come home, and his mother would not stop saying, "Accident." "Not now," she told the child inside her. "Please, not here." The pain loosened, but it left sweat on her lip and a warning in her bones. She sat back on her heels. The hole she had opened was no wider than a serving plate. At its bottom, one bead of water formed on a root end, trembled, and fell. It was not enough to drink. It was enough to prove the ground had not forgotten how. Maggie took out her handkerchief, folded it small, and pressed it into the dampest place. When she lifted it, the cotton held a faint brown stain of moisture. She touched it to the foal's mouth. The animal licked weakly, then bumped her wrist with a hunger that was almost trust. A voice behind her said, "If you have found what I think you have found, do not dig any deeper alone." Maggie twisted so fast her palm closed around the hoof knife. An old woman stood in the stable doorway with a black medical bag in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Her gray hair was pinned under a faded hat. Her eyes were the color of creek stones after rain. "I am Ruth Calder," she said. "And if I meant you harm, Mrs. Rowe, I would have let Vane come first." Maggie did not lower the knife. "Who sent you?" "No one with clean hands." "That is not an answer." "No," Ruth said. "But it is the truth." The foal shifted behind Maggie, and Ruth's gaze moved to its bandaged leg. Her mouth tightened. So there was one left. One what? One thing he did not manage to make disappear. Maggie stood slowly, anger helping where strength failed. "You know Mr. Vane? Everyone in this valley knows Silas Vane. Most just pretend they don't." Ruth set the shotgun against the wall, far from her hand, then opened her bag. "Sit down before your body makes the choice for you. I am not sick. You are 7 months gone, thirsty, frightened, and digging like a miner in a dress. Sit." The sharpness should have offended Maggie. Instead, it sounded like the first honest thing anyone had said since Daniel's funeral. She sat on an overturned feed box. Ruth checked her pulse, asked about pains, counted the baby's movement with a hand that was brisk but not unkind. She gave Maggie a small packet of willow bark and another of dried mint, then looked at the hole behind the stall. "How did you know to come?" Maggie asked. "I saw Vane's buggy leave this road yesterday. Men like him do not bring water unless they are afraid thirst will not work fast enough." Maggie looked down at her stained handkerchief. Afraid of mud, afraid of memory. Outside, the morning light spread across the yard. Dust lifted around the new fence posts, blocking the road. Ruth saw them and swore softly. He wasted no time. Who is he trying to keep out? Ruth looked at her. Maybe no one. Maybe you. The answer settled cold in Maggie's stomach. Ruth walked to the back of the stable and crouched without touching the opened ground. She studied the stones Maggie had laid aside. The cut cactus roots. The narrow line beneath the canvas. 3 families left this valley swearing their wells died in the same year, she said. The Marlowe place. The Sutter place. My sister's place. Maggie heard the change in her voice on the last words. "What happened to your sister?" Ruth's hand closed around the strap of her bag. "Winter happened after men convinced her the land had no more use for her." The foal lowered its head to Maggie's shoulder, as if the story itself had weight. Maggie looked at the damp hole, then at the old woman. "What is under my stable?" Ruth did not answer right away. She stood, walked to the doorway, and looked over the broken yard, as if seeing another ranch laid over this one. Greener, louder, alive with stock and children and the sound of buckets striking full troughs. "At last," she said, "before they taught this valley to call it dead, your husband's people had another name for this place." Maggie waited. Ruth turned back, her face grave. "They called it Rowe Spring." Ruth left after noon, but her warning stayed. "Do not dig any deeper alone." Maggie told herself she would obey. She told herself she would rest, drink a little, feed the foal, and wait until the old midwife returned with a stronger shovel and more sense than Maggie currently possessed. Then she looked at the rear stall. The place had a shape now. Not just stones over damp earth. Not just cactus roots sewn across a secret. A shape. A line. A corner. Something made by hands and hidden under dirt. She could not unsee it. The foal stood near her shoulder while she studied the stall floor. Its ears flicked toward every sound outside, but it no longer stepped away when her skirt brushed its leg. Maggie had begun calling it dust because its coat seemed made of the ranch itself, pale and stubborn and not finished living. "Your mama stood here, didn't she?" Maggie whispered. The foal lowered its nose to the worn boards. Maggie followed its gaze. Under the place where an old mare might have stood, one floorboard sat a little higher than the rest. The edges were packed with dust, but the nailheads were brighter, less rusted, newer, not new enough for a careless eye, new enough for a woman who had learned to read a hoof by its smallest crack. She knelt, slid her hoof knife along the seam, and felt hollow air beneath. Her pulse changed. A wagon rattled at the front gate. Maggie stood so fast, the stable swayed around her. She kicked loose straw over the board and stepped into the yard. Caleb Rowe sat alone on the wagon seat this time. No wife, no black bonnet, no straight-back judgment. Just Caleb, hat pulled low, face gray with dust and something worse. "I brought flour," he said. Maggie looked at the small sack beside him. From kindness? His jaw tightened. From what is left of it. He would not cross the yard. He kept glancing toward the ridge road, then toward the stable. Maggie saw sweat darken his collar, though the wind had turned cool. "Did Vane send you?" she asked. Caleb flinched at the name. "That is answer enough." He climbed down and lifted the flour sack with both hands. A tin cup clinked inside it. "Ma says you need to sign when he comes back. She says the family cannot carry Daniel's debts and yours." "My debts?" "The funeral. The doctor. The feed bill Daniel left." Daniel left no feed bill. He sold his saddle in February to clear it. Caleb's eyes moved to hers then, quick and pained. "You know that? I was his wife." For a moment, he looked like a man standing before a door he had helped nail shut. Then his fear returned. "Listen to me. Vane has papers. Better papers than anything out here. If you fight him, he will make you look unfit. He will say grief has turned your head. He will say no decent court leaves a widow in your condition alone on bad land. Then why is he so eager to own bad land?" Caleb said nothing. From the stable, Dust gave a soft nicker. Caleb's face drained. "That thing is still alive? That thing has a name. You should not keep it. Because it will die? Because it proves," he stopped. Maggie waited. Caleb shut his mouth so hard the muscle jumped in his cheek. He carried the flour to the gate, but did not open it. "Take this, please." When Maggie reached for the sack, his fingers closed around her wrist. Not hard. Desperate. "Do not let him find the board," he whispered. "What board?" His eyes shot toward the stable. "Under the mare's stall." The words struck her so sharply she almost dropped the sack. A buggy sounded somewhere beyond the ridge. Caleb released her at once. "I was never here." He swung back onto the wagon and drove away too fast, leaving wheel marks like cuts in the dust. Maggie carried the flour inside, hands shaking. In the sack, beneath the cup, was a torn scrap of paper folded twice. She did not open it yet. She hid it in the cracked blue cup and went first to the stable. The board was still covered. Dust stood over it like a guard. By dusk, Maggie had decided she would not pry it up until Ruth came back. She set stones around the damp opening, cleaned Dust's leg, and carried the last of Silas's water to the kitchen. That was when she smelled it. Sharp, black. Wrong, not rot, not clay, oil. She ran to the rear of the stable. The damp place she had opened that morning shone dark beneath the stones. A slick film spread across the little hollow, catching the last light in ugly colors. Someone had poured oil into the earth where the water had gathered. For a moment, Maggie could not breathe. Then dust pushed past her, lowering its mouth toward the poisoned damp. No! Maggie grabbed the foal's neck and pulled with all the strength left in her. Dust fought once, weak but frightened, then stumbled back. Maggie fell hard onto her side. Pain flashed across her belly. She curled around it, waiting, counting, praying until the tightness eased. When she could stand, she scooped the oiled mud away with a broken plate and threw it beyond the fence, one handful after another, until her arms shook. Whoever had done this had not come to scare her. They had come to kill the proof before it could become water. Only after dark did she remember the scrap in the blue cup. She unfolded it by moonlight. The handwriting was Caleb's. Rough and hurried. Don't let Vane find the board under the mare's stall. Ruth returned before sunrise with a shovel, a lantern, and the look of a woman who had already decided fear would have to wait. She found Maggie asleep against the stable wall, Dust's head near her knee, the hoof knife still in her hand. Someone poured oil into it, Maggie said before Ruth could scold her. Ruth's face did not show surprise. It showed recognition. They did that to my sister's well, she said. Not enough to ruin it forever. Just enough to make her believe the water had turned against her. Maggie sat up. Then this happened before. More than once. Dust stepped over the hidden board and stamped lightly, as if the foal had grown tired of people talking around the secret. Ruth saw it. That animal knows, or remembers where its mother stood. That is sometimes the same thing. They cleared the straw from the mare's stall. Maggie showed Ruth the board with the newer nails. Ruth ran a finger along the seam and pulled back a line of dust. This was opened after the rest of the floor aged, she said, with Vane looking for it. With somebody afraid you would find it first. Maggie slid the hoof knife into the crack. Ruth used the shovel tip for leverage. The board resisted, groaned, then lifted with a sound like an old breath leaving the ground. Beneath it was a narrow wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Maggie reached for it, then stopped. Her hands were shaking. Ruth did not touch it. It is yours to open. That is what frightens me. Good. Fear keeps careless hands from ruining old paper. Maggie pulled the box free and set it on the stall floor. Inside lay a bundle tied with faded blue ribbon, a folded map, and a small envelope with Maggie's name written across it. Not Mrs. Rowe. Maggie. For a moment, that hurt more than grief. Start with the map, Ruth said. Maggie unfolded it carefully. The paper had yellowed, but the ink still held. It showed the Rowe ranch as it must have been years before. House, stable, lower pasture, wash, windmill, and beneath the stable line, drawn in blue, a spring channel running southwest toward 3 smaller properties. At the head of the channel, Daniel had circled 2 words. Rowe Spring. Ruth leaned closer. There it is. But the town map shows nothing here. The town map is a liar. Maggie traced the blue line. It did not stop at her fence. It ran toward the small farm she had seen from Caleb's wagon, the ones with empty troughs and thin barns. She remembered children watching from doorways, women carrying dry buckets, men pretending not to look at the Vane fences. This water fed more than this ranch, she said. Yes. The bundle held a water right certificate dated 22 years earlier, signed by Daniel's father and witnessed by a territorial clerk. There were tax receipts, survey notes, and boundary descriptions, each one marked with the same blue channel. A second sheet listed the Marlowe place, the Sutter place, and Ruth Calder's sister's farm as lower users of the spring. On the last page, someone had written in the margin, "Spring concealed from revised county record." Maggie stared at the words. Concealed, she whispered. Not dried. The lie had been simple enough to survive. A spring erased from a map became a rumor. A rumor became a failed well. A failed well became a family packing a wagon in winter. The dead ranch was not dead. It had been made quiet, made ugly, made hopeless. Every cracked trough, every empty pasture, every family that had left with furniture tied to a wagon suddenly looked less like failure and more like evidence. And Daniel had known. He had stood close enough to the truth to feel its blade turn toward him. Maggie opened the envelope. The letter had been folded twice. Daniel's handwriting was cramped, as if written in hiding. Maggie, if Caleb did as I asked, you are reading this before Vane gets the board. If he did not, forgive him if you can. He is weak when frightened, but not cruel in his bones. I was wrong to keep you from this place. I thought leaving the ranch alone would keep us clear of old trouble. Then I found Father's papers and saw what Vane's family did to the spring records. It was never drought that broke the Marlowe and Sutter places. It was men with ink. Maggie pressed one hand to her mouth. I went to Vane yesterday. I wanted him to know I had copies. That was foolish. On the road home, the brake strap slipped. When I checked it after reaching the lower bend, the leather had been cut clean halfway through. If anything happens to me before I get this to you, do not trust the accident they hand you. The stable swayed. Ruth caught Maggie by the elbow. Sit. Maggie sat because her legs had forgotten their purpose. The accident they hand you. For 4 days. Daniel's death had been a stone placed on her chest by God. Weather, bad road, bad luck. Now the stone cracked open, and something uglier breathed underneath. Ruth lifted the brake strap Daniel had tucked inside the envelope. The cut was clean, angled, deliberate. This is not wear, Ruth said. I know. Maggie did know. A worn strap frayed. A dry strap split. This had been sliced and left to finish its work on a downhill road. Daniel had not simply died. He had been sent toward death, carrying a truth someone wanted buried. Maggie unfolded the last page. You will be told to sell. You will be told the land is worthless. You will be told a woman with a child coming has no business fighting men who own judges, wells, and roads. Listen to Ruth Calder if she comes. Watch the foal if it lives. The mare always knew where the ground breathed. I should have trusted you sooner. I am trusting you now. Daniel. Dust pressed its damp muzzle against Maggie's shoulder. The small warmth kept her inside her own body. Before this morning, Maggie had wanted water enough to live. Now she had proof. Ruth knelt beside her. You can still sell. No one would blame you. A room in town, a doctor, food, safety. If Vane keeps his word long enough. Maggie looked at the blue line running beyond her fence. Then she looked at Dust, standing over the stall where its mother had guarded a box full of human cowardice and human courage. No, Maggie said. The steadiness of the word surprised even her. She folded Daniel's letter and tucked it inside her dress, close to the child who would never hear his father's voice, but might still inherit his warning. This is not just my water, she said. Ruth exhaled, as if she had been holding that truth for years. Before Maggie could wrap the papers again, Dust lifted its head toward the open yard. A buggy wheel creaked somewhere beyond the ridge. Ruth reached for the shotgun. Maggie closed the box. For the first time, the ranch did not feel dead around her. It felt awake. And Daniel's death was no longer only a sorrow behind her. It might have been the first warning buried with him. Silas Vane did not come back alone. By mid-morning, his black buggy rolled through the heat with a second wagon behind it. And Maggie knew before she saw the papers that mercy had changed its clothes. Beside Silas sat a man in a brown suit too clean for the road, a leather case on his knees. Behind them rode Sheriff Abel Crouch, one hand on his saddle horn, his badge catching sunlight like a warning. Ruth stood at the kitchen window with the shotgun lowered beside her skirt. You have the box hidden? Under the ash pit, Maggie said. The papers? Maggie touched the cloth band beneath her dress. Daniel's letter, the certificate, and the map lay flat against her belly, held by the same linen meant to support the child. It felt strange, carrying proof where she carried life. Dust shifted in the stable. Silas stepped down with his hat in hand. His smile was patient enough to insult her. Mrs. Rowe, he said, I hoped rest might soften your opinion. Rest is hard, with men breathing outside my fence at night. The lawyer's eyes flicked toward Silas. Silas did not look at him. This is Mr. Pritchard. He handles property transfers. I thought we might spare you another trip to town. How thoughtful. You need more than thoughts. Silas gestured toward the second wagon. Flour, beans, 2 quilts, a proper mattress, and a note of credit with Dr. Bell. Sign today, and you can be in town by supper. Ruth made a low sound behind Maggie. Silas heard it. Mrs. Calder, I did not know you had taken employment here. I do not work for men who poison wells. The yard went still. Sheriff Crouch shifted in his saddle. Careful, Ruth. With what? She asked. Memory? Silas raised one hand, mild as church glass. No one wants harsh words. Mrs. Rowe is in a delicate state. Grief and thirst make any person suspicious. I am suspicious because men keep offering to save me from land they claim is worthless. Pritchard opened his case and removed papers. The offer is generous. It releases you from liability, unpaid taxes, structural danger, livestock loss, and all subsurface claims attached to the property. Maggie heard the hidden tooth. All what? Standard language, Silas said quickly. Then read it slowly. Pritchard looked annoyed, but Silas smiled. Before we make this unpleasant, consider your child. A woman alone out here risks more than pride. Maggie felt the baby move under the folded map. Dust cried from the stable. A hired man Maggie had not seen before stood at the stable entrance with a rope in his hand. Dust backed away, legs skidding on the boards, eyes white with terror. Maggie moved before thought. She crossed the yard with the hoof knife open. Step away from that animal. The hired man lifted both hands. Mr. Vane said it was a stray. Mr. Vane lies easily. Silas's voice hardened. The foal is half-starved. It should be put down or taken somewhere useful. The dust lunged against the stall wall. Maggie slipped between them and set one palm against its neck. The animal shook so violently she felt each bone. You will not touch it. Sheriff Crouch rode closer. No need for a scene. There is already a scene, Maggie said. It began when he sent a man into my stable without asking. Silas looked past her, not at Dust, but at the mare's stall floor. The hidden board was covered again, yet his gaze went to the exact place. Maggie's skin chilled. You have been digging, he said. I have been surviving. In poisoned ground? Ruth's eyes narrowed. Silas turned to the sheriff. This is what I feared. She has found seepwater, bad seepwater, and thinks it means something. Rowe Spring dried long ago. Everyone knows that. The words fell too fast. Maggie did not move. Ruth did. She took one slow step onto the porch. Who said anything about Rowe Spring? Silas's face did not change enough for most people to see it. Maggie saw it, because she had spent days studying small signs. Dust's damp muzzle, the cut strap, Caleb's fear. For one breath, Silas looked angry at his own mouth. Then Sheriff Crouch spoke over the silence. Old names float around. No crime in knowing old names. Then why did the county erase that one? Maggie asked. The sheriff looked at her sharply. You do not want trouble over water rights. Maggie felt Ruth go still. Water rights. She had not said those words either. Pritchard gathered the papers. Mrs. Rowe, nobody here is your enemy. But if you refuse a lawful offer and insist on staying in an unsafe condition, questions may be raised about your judgment. My judgment? A court considers the welfare of a child, he said. Silas's smile returned, smaller now. No one wants that. Sign, and the question never leaves this yard. There it was. Not charity. A cage with a doctor's name painted on the door. Maggie looked at the flower, the quilts, the mattress. Her body wanted them. Her child might need them. That was what made the trap cruel. Dust pressed its face against her sleeve. I will not sign today. Silas put his hat back on. Then you should expect inspection. By whom? Sheriff Crouch dismounted and walked toward the stable. By the law. Ruth lifted the shotgun just enough to change the air. The sheriff stopped. Do not be foolish. Foolish is walking onto a widow's property after threatening her child, Pritchard whispered to Silas. Silas's jaw tightened, but he raised a hand. Another day, Sheriff. Mrs. Rowe needs time to think. He climbed into the buggy. Before he turned the horses, his eyes met Maggie's. You mistake stubbornness for protection, he said. Out here, things disappear. Water, horses, papers, people. The buggy rolled away. The sheriff followed last, but not before Maggie saw the folded map tucked inside his coat pocket. Its corner showed a red survey mark, the same crooked symbol drawn across the revised county line Daniel had circled. When the dust settled, Ruth barred the gate with a broken fence rail. Maggie checked Dust's leg, then the board, then the damp earth. Nothing had been taken. Not this time. But her hands would not stop shaking. Ruth saw. "Give me the papers. I can hide them." "No, Maggie. No one else carries this for me." She retied the linen around her belly, tighter than before, sealing Daniel's letter and the water rights certificate beneath the cloth. The baby turned once under her hands, alive and restless. Outside, Silas Vane's tracks cut deep into the dust. Maggie looked toward the road and understood that if they found the proof, they would not need to kill her. They would only need to make the world believe she had lost her mind before the child was born. Ruth did not take Maggie to town by the main road. She hitched a dun mare to a narrow cart just after dawn and led it through a wash behind the ranch, where mesquite branches dragged against the wheels and hid their tracks. Maggie sat beside her with Daniel's papers wrapped under her dress and Dust tied loosely to the cart rail, limping but determined to follow. "You should be lying down," Ruth said. "You said that yesterday, and you ignored me yesterday. I am listening today. I am just not obeying." Ruth almost smiled. Daniel chose trouble well. The first place they reached had once been the Marlowe farm. Maggie knew it by the empty house, the dry trough, and a child's swing hanging from a dead cottonwood. A woman named Elsie Marlowe opened the door only after Ruth called 3 times. When Elsie saw Maggie's belly, her face softened. When she saw the foal, it hardened with memory. "That spring reached here," Ruth said. Elsie looked past them toward Vane's distant fences. "No spring reaches anybody after a rich man needs it." Maggie unfolded only the edge of the old map. "I need dates. Anything you remember." Elsie laughed without humor. "Men with papers never cared what I remembered. I am not asking like them." That changed the room. Elsie brought out a biscuit tin filled with scraps, a feed receipt, a tax notice, a note from her dead husband saying the lower ditch ran wet 2 days before the county declared the channel abandoned. Her youngest son had written numbers on the back in a child's hand. "Why keep these?" Maggie asked. "Because throwing them away felt like agreeing." At the Sutter place, an old man met them with a shotgun and a bottle on the porch. People in Red Mesa called Jonah Sutter a drunk. He did not deny it. But when Maggie showed him the blue line on Daniel's map, his cloudy eyes sharpened. "They moved the line," he said. "Who?" "County surveyor. Vane paid him in cattle. I saw the red mark change from this side of the wash to that side." He tapped the paper with one trembling finger. "I told folks." "Folks said whiskey drew maps in my head." Ruth's voice went low. "Can you say that in front of the council?" Jonah looked toward a young man splitting wood behind the house. "My grandson works Vane Range. A man can lose more than pride by telling truth." Maggie folded the map. "Then tell me enough that I can carry it." He gave her an old survey invoice with the same crooked red mark Maggie had seen on the sheriff's map. On the ride back, Dust stumbled. Maggie climbed down to steady him and saw Caleb waiting near a dry arroyo, hat in both hands. Ruth reached for the shotgun. Caleb raised his palms. "I only came to give her this." He held out a folded scrap. Maggie did not take it. "Why now?" she asked. "Because Vane knows Daniel made more than one copy. Because Ma is burning boxes. Because I have heard that Foal crying in my sleep. You helped leave me there." His eyes filled, but he did not ask forgiveness. That made him harder to hate. "I know." Maggie took the scrap. It was the missing bottom of Daniel's first letter. "If I do not come home, ask Ruth about her sister. Ask Jonah Sutter what he saw on the survey day. And if Caleb is brave only once, let that once be enough." Caleb looked away. "He always thought better of me than I deserved." "Then deserve it now. Stand with me." Fear shut his face. "I cannot." "Not yet." A sound came from behind the arroyo wall. All 3 turned. A thin man stepped into view, pale under his hat. Maggie knew him from the livery yard. He had been there the day Daniel's wagon was brought in broken. Ruth said, "Mr. Haskell." The man swallowed. "I saw somebody near Daniel's brake strap before he left town. One of Vane's hands. I saw the knife." Maggie's grip tightened on the cart rail. "Will you say that publicly?" she asked. Haskell looked at Caleb, then at Ruth, then at the road. "I wanted to. That is why I followed." Dust lifted his head and gave a weak nicker. Hooves sounded beyond the rise. Haskell's face collapsed. "I was wrong to come, Mr. Haskell. I saw nothing." He backed away. "I am sorry." He vanished into the brush just as two Vane riders crossed the ridge at an easy pace, pretending not to watch. Caleb cursed under his breath. "That is how he does it. He lets you know your courage has witnesses. Then we will give his fear witnesses too," Ruth said. But Maggie heard the strain beneath her words. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had gone copper. Maggie spread the scraps on the kitchen floor. Elsie's receipts, Jonah's invoice, Daniel's letter, the old map, the water certificate. They made no single clean weapon. Not yet. They were fragments, bruises, echoes. Still, when placed together, they had a shape. Vane had not merely stolen water. He had taught the valley to doubt its own thirst. Ruth knelt beside the papers. "You have enough to make people listen." "No," Maggie said, looking toward the road where Haskell had disappeared. "I have enough to make them afraid." Dust nosed the doorway, leaving a damp mark on the sill. Maggie touched it with 2 fingers. She had names. She had dates. She had proof enough to see the lie. But as night came down over the ranch, she did not yet have one living soul willing to stand beside her where Silas Vane could see. The meeting was called for 4 o'clock, when the heat made men short-tempered and women too tired to argue unless the matter was worth blood. By 3, every bench in the Red Mesa storage barn was full. Maggie stood outside with Ruth on one side, Dust on the other, and Daniel's papers sewn into the lining of her old shawl. The foal had no business walking that far, but when Ruth tried to leave him behind, Dust planted his thin legs and refused to move. "Stubborn animal," Ruth muttered. Maggie touched his neck. He learned from the land. Inside, Silas Vane was already speaking. "Not a punishment," he said, his voice smooth enough to oil a blade. "It is a rescue. Mrs. Rowe is alone, grieving, near her confinement, and being encouraged by people who should know better to believe old stories about a dead property." A few heads turned when Maggie entered, some with pity, some with shame, some with the quick fear of people who had already decided silence was safer than truth. Sheriff Crouch stood near the front table. Mr. Pritchard had papers laid out before him. Beside them sat Dr. Bell, red-faced and uncomfortable, holding a folded statement he would not meet Maggie's eyes over. Silas smiled when he saw her. "Mrs. Rowe, we were just discussing your welfare." "No," Maggie said. "You were discussing my land before I arrived." A murmur crossed the room. Pritchard rose. "This meeting concerns the lawful transfer of abandoned and non-viable property." "It is not abandoned. I live there." Silas's expression softened for the crowd. "You sleep in a roofless house beside poisoned seep water with a half-dead animal and no proper care. That is not living, Mrs. Rowe. That is desperation." Dr. Bell cleared his throat. Maggie looked at him. "Did you examine me?" He swallowed. "No." "Did you examine the water?" "No." "Then what did you sign?" The doctor's face went darker. Silas answered for him. "A professional concern. Nothing more." Ruth stepped forward. Concern does not usually come folded in a lawyer's case. Sheriff Crouch struck the table once. "Enough. Mrs. Rowe, if you have something relevant, say it." Maggie took the old water certificate from her shawl. Pritchard's eyes sharpened. Silas did not move at all. "This ranch has a spring," Maggie said. "It was recorded 22 years ago as Rowe Spring. The certificate names the Rowe Ranch as the head source and lists lower users on the Marlowe, Sutter, and Calder properties." Voices rose. Elsie Marlowe stood near the back with her hands locked together. Jonah Sutter stared at the floor. Pritchard took the certificate, held it as if age itself were a disease, and gave it to the sheriff. "Old paper, possibly irrelevant." The current county map shows no active spring on Rowe land. Sheriff Crouch unfolded a map and laid it flat. There it was. The public lie. The wash was drawn. The fences were drawn. Vane's range lines were drawn, thick and clean. Rowe Spring was gone. Maggie felt the room shifting away from her. Silas saw it too. "This is what grief does," he said gently. "It makes a person reach for any scrap that says the dead were not taken for nothing." The words found their mark. Maggie's throat tightened, but she kept standing. Then Silas turned to the crowd. "Ask yourselves whether a woman in her condition should be trusted with legal judgment when she has been sleeping beside bad water and talking to a starving colt." A few men looked down. Dr. Bell finally spoke. "Pregnancy can make exhaustion dangerous. Confusion is possible." "Confusion?" Maggie repeated. He flinched. "I did not say you were confused." But he needed the room to hear the word. Silas sighed, as if saddened by her tone. Obstacle 1 had a face now. Not law, not fact, but the old belief that a frightened woman could be renamed unstable if enough men said it softly. Maggie unfolded Daniel's map. "This is the original survey." Pritchard frowned. "Unverified. This is Jonah Sutter's invoice with the red correction mark." Jonah's head jerked up. Maggie held it high. "This mark matches the one on the sheriff's private map." The room went quiet. Sheriff Crouch's hand moved toward his coat. Ruth's shotgun did not rise, but everyone remembered she had brought it. Maggie turned to Jonah. "Tell them what you saw." The old man's mouth opened. Through the barn doors, 2 Vane riders appeared and stopped in the sun. Jonah saw them, his courage drained so visibly that half the room seemed to feel it leave. "I saw nothing clear," he whispered. Silas smiled. Obstacle 2 settled over the room. The paper was called old, the map called unofficial, the witness called unreliable before he even finished breathing. Maggie felt the baby turn. She placed one hand over her belly, not to look weak, but to steady the life inside her while she spoke for the dead. "Then I will say what the land says." Silas laughed once. "The land does not testify." "No, but liars do." She turned to him. "Yesterday, in my yard, you said Rowe Spring dried long ago." His smile thinned. "I had not said that name to you. Ruth had not said it in your hearing. Caleb had not. The county map does not show it. Your own lawyer says it is irrelevant old paper." Sheriff Crouch said, "Old names are known." "Then say where you learned it." Silence. Maggie stepped closer to the table. "If the spring never mattered, why did your men oil the seep behind my stable? If the ranch is worthless, why did you send a man to take the foal? If the map is wrong, why is the same red correction mark in the sheriff's coat and on Jonah Sutter's invoice?" Pritchard began gathering papers. "This is disorderly." "No," Ruth said. "This is the first orderly thing this town has done in years." Then Elsie Marlowe stood. Her voice shook. "My husband said the ditch ran wet 2 days before the county declared it abandoned." Jonah Sutter raised his head. The Vane riders watched him through the open doors. He looked at Maggie, then at Dust, whose damp muzzle had left dark spots on the barn floor. "I saw the surveyor move the line," Jonah said. "Vane paid him in cattle." The barn erupted. Silas slammed his hand on the table. "Enough." And there it was. Not smoothness, not mercy, not concern. Fear. He pointed at the foal. "That animal proves nothing. It drank from Rowe Spring because some fool opened a poisoned seep that should have stayed buried." The room died around his words. Maggie did not speak at first. She did not have to. Everyone had heard it. Rowe Spring. Drank. Opened. Buried. Silas realized too late that rage had done what kindness could not. It had told the truth in pieces too sharp to hide. Ruth whispered, "There." Maggie laid Daniel's cut brake strap on the table beside the water certificate. "My husband found the papers," she said. Then his brake strap was cut. "If you doubt me in front of a territorial marshal, not in a barn owned by the man who just admitted he knew what was buried under my stable." Sheriff Crouch folded his map, but Caleb appeared at the barn door and blocked him. For once, Daniel's brother did not look away. "I carried the first letter," Caleb said. And I can tell where Vane told my mother to send Maggie. Maggie's eyes stung, but she did not lower them. Dust stepped forward, thin and trembling, and pressed his wet mouth against her hand. She lifted that hand for the room to see. Water does not make a dead place, she said. Lies do. Outside, far beyond the barn, thunder moved over the dry hills, though no rain had yet fallen. Rain did not come. The thunder rolled over Red Mesa, shook dust from the storage barn rafters, and moved on as if even the sky wanted witnesses before giving relief. For several seconds after Silas spoke, no one moved. Then Mr. Pritchard closed his leather case with hands that had lost their neatness. I believe, he said carefully, this transfer should be delayed until the documents can be reviewed by the territorial office. Silas turned on him. You work for me. I work under law, Pritchard said. And for the first time, he sounded as if he remembered what that meant. Sheriff Crouch tried to step around Caleb. This meeting is over. Caleb did not move. His face was pale, but his boots stayed planted in the barn doorway. Not until you empty your coat. The sheriff's hand twitched. Ruth lifted the shotgun. Nobody cheered. Nobody gasped. The town had gone too quiet for that. Slowly, Crouch pulled out the folded map. Its red correction mark lay crooked across the old wash line, just as Jonah Sutter had said. Elsie Marlowe began to cry without covering her face. Dr. Bell came forward next. He looked smaller than he had at the table. Mrs. Rowe, I signed a concern statement after Mr. Vane told me you were fevered and drinking tainted water. I did not examine you. I should have. Maggie wanted to hate him. She was too tired for the luxury. Then examine the truth more carefully next time, she said. Silas reached for the water certificate, but dust snapped his head up and struck one hoof against the floor. The sound cracked through the barn. Touch that, Ruth said, and I will stop being old before I stop being accurate. Pritchard gathered the certificate himself and handed it back to Maggie. Keep this hidden no longer. File it publicly. Today, if possible. Can I? He glanced at the sheriff, then at the room full of people who were watching now. You have witnesses. Witnesses. The word did not make the ranch whole. It did not bring Daniel back. It did not scrub oil from the earth or mend the stable roof, but it stood upright in the room, and Maggie felt something in the town shift around it. Caleb stepped forward, holding a folded page. I have the rest of Daniel's copy, he said. Silas's face darkened. You stupid boy. Caleb flinched. Then he looked at Maggie and did not look away. I brought her to the ranch because Ma said Vane would settle our debts if she signed. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway. His voice broke. Daniel gave me this before he died. I hid it because I was afraid. He laid the page beside the brake strap. It named the surveyor. It named the day Vane's men visited the stable. It named the lower families who still held use rights if Rose Spring could be proven alive. Jonah took off his hat. It is alive, Elsie nodded. My husband knew it, Ruth said. My sister died knowing it. One by one, the room stopped being a crowd and became a record. Silas backed toward the door. No one grabbed him. That would have been too simple. Men like him did not vanish in one brave minute. They had lawyers, ledgers, cousins, judges, and favors stacked like cordwood. But he no longer had silence. Pritchard agreed to send a rider to the territorial marshal. Dr. Bell agreed to write a new statement. Crouch, under 20 watching eyes, surrendered the revised map to Ruth until an outside officer could take it. The council clerk, shaking badly, wrote that transfer of the Rowe Ranch was suspended pending investigation of water records and possible fraud. Temporary. Fragile. Enough. By sundown, Maggie rode back in Ruth's cart, with the papers in a flour sack and dust walking behind them, slow but steady. Caleb followed at a distance, not forgiven, not cast away. At the ranch gate, Maggie climbed down without help. The house still leaned. The windmill still screamed. The stable still smelled of oil, fear, and old straw. Nothing had become easy just because truth had spoken once in public. Maggie stood in the yard until the baby moved under her hand. Then she carried Daniel's letter into the kitchen, set the water certificate beneath the cracked blue cup, and picked up a broom. She did not return as a woman who had won everything. She returned as a woman who had finally been allowed to begin. The first court order did not arrive as a trumpet. It came folded in a plain envelope, carried by a tired territorial clerk whose horse wanted shade more than justice. Ruth read it twice at the kitchen table, while Maggie stood beside the stove with her newborn son asleep against her shoulder. Temporary recognition of Rowe Spring. Temporary protection of lower use rights. Temporary suspension of all vain claims pending full investigation. Temporary was not a word a hungry heart loved, but it was a word the law could hold. And sometimes, holding was the first miracle. Maggie named the baby Daniel Thomas Rowe, not because grief needed a monument, but because truth deserved a witness who would grow. The ranch did not heal quickly. Nothing worth saving ever did. The oil-stained earth behind the stable had to be scraped out by hand and hauled away in broken buckets. The first clear trickle came back thin as thread, then finger-wide, then steady enough to fill a shallow wooden trough. Ruth and Caleb built from old fence boards. Every time water touched the dry grain, the wood gave off a smell like something waking from a long fever. Dust grew stronger before the house did. His ribs disappeared under a summer coat. His legs lost their tremble. He still startled when strange men came near, but he no longer ran from every shadow. Some mornings, he stood over the open spring channel and dipped his muzzle into the flow as if checking that the land remembered its promise. Caleb came twice a week. At first, he stood outside the gate and asked what needed lifting. Maggie gave him hard jobs because forgiveness, like water, should not be confused with softness. He repaired the stable wall. He dug post holes. He rode to town to file copies of every receipt, statement, and map. He did not ask to hold the baby until autumn. When Maggie finally placed the child in his arms, Caleb cried so silently that she let him keep his face turned away. Silas Vane did not fall in one clean motion. Men like him cracked in stages. The territorial marshal found altered survey records, paid witnesses, and 3 different versions of the same county map. Sheriff Crouch resigned before anyone could force him to say the word guilt. Dr. Bell made his apology public from the church steps, his voice shaking so badly that even Ruth did not interrupt. Vane's north pastures were placed under review. His men stopped riding the ridge. His name still carried weight in Red Mesa, but now people heard the chain dragging behind it. One evening in late October, Elsie Marlowe arrived with 2 empty barrels in her wagon. "I came to ask," she said, as if asking were harder than work. Maggie looked past her toward the lower valley. Jonah Sutter waited by the road with his hat in both hands. Behind him stood 3 families who had spent years pretending their thirst was private. Maggie did not make them beg. She had spent too many nights with a dry mouth to turn water into a throne. They built a split-rail channel together, rough and crooked at first, running from the spring bed toward the old lower ditch. Ruth kept the baby under a patched umbrella, while Maggie marked the slope with stakes. Caleb swung the shovel. Jonah argued with everyone, and was right about the grade more often than he was polite. When the first water reached the Marlowe ditch, Elsie knelt in the mud and put both hands into it. Nobody spoke. Some victories were too old to cheer. By winter, the ranch still looked poor from the road. The house leaned less, but it leaned. The windmill had 3 blades instead of 2. The kitchen window held mismatched glass. The stable roof wore fresh boards like a scar not ashamed of itself. But the troughs no longer stood empty. That changed how people looked at the place. More important, it changed how Maggie looked at herself. She had arrived as cargo someone else had unloaded. She had stayed because an animal weaker than she was needed water. She had fought because Daniel left proof. But she endured because, day after day, the ranch gave her work her hands could understand. Mend the rail, boil the cloth, cool the baby, clean the channel, trust the small flow. On the first morning of spring, Maggie carried her son to the stable before sunrise. Dust was waiting, tall now. Not yet a horse, but no longer a question of survival. He lowered his head to the baby's blanket and breathed softly against Daniel Thomas's tiny fist. The child opened his hand. Maggie laughed before she realized she could. The sound startled a mourning dove from the roof beam. Outside, water moved through the wooden trough, clear enough to hold the pale sky. It crossed the yard in a narrow line, slipped under the fence, and continued toward the lower valley, where other lamps were beginning to glow in other kitchens. Maggie stood there until sunlight reached the stable floor. On the wall above the mare's stall, Caleb had nailed a small board Ruth carved by hand. Rowe Spring, kept by those who stayed. Maggie touched the words. The world had called her a widow, with nowhere to go. The world had called the ranch dead. But the land had not asked whether she was strong enough before needing her. It had simply waited under stone, under lies, under dust, for someone desperate and tender enough to listen. And because Maggie stayed long enough to hear it, the place gave her back a home, a name, and a reason to stand.